My name is John St. Clair, and I'm the leader of the Inland Valley Storytellers, and welcome to the 18th annual Inland Valley Storytellers Tellabration. And we started as a group in 2003, and that was the first year we produced a Tellabration, and have been doing so every year since then. And is the spotlight still on me, Angela?
Yes.
Okay, good. You all can see me. Good. So there are a couple things I need to talk about. First of all, we want everybody to be muted. And at the end of the stories, the end of the concert, we'll open it up for people to unmute themselves if they want to and make comments or ask questions or whatever. And until then, the only people that are unmuted are the people who are telling a story, or me, the master of ceremonies, when I'm introducing someone. And I want to point out in the chat section right now, I am going to paste in 2 links. And one of the links is to the National Storytelling Network donation page, because when Tellabration first started, it was a way to raise money for the Association of Storytellers, which is now called the National Storytelling Network. And then I'm also, the other link is the link to the Inland Valley Storytellers webpage. And at the bottom of the homepage, if you so desire, there's information on how to do a donation there. And I will paste these in at the end of the meeting as well. So Inland Valley Storytellers meets the second Tuesday of every month, and it's a Zoom meeting. It used to be in person, but if you want to attend, you can email me from the webpage or get on our mailing list if you want to get the regular emails about what's happening. So now what I'm going to do is I am going to read to you the Tellabration Proclamation. In the name of storytelling, the National Storytelling Network and the Inland Valley Storytellers are proud to sponsor Tellabration 2020, the worldwide event of storytelling at this time of year across 6 continents in 40 states and 9 countries, from Sacramento to Savannah, Boise to Barcelona, West Virginia to West Indies, Sonoma County to Inland Empire of Southern California. Over 300 audiences are gathered for this spectacular storytelling event. Enjoy and enjoy and anticipation, let the stories begin. And the first storyteller is me. And I'm going to tell a story that is an original story written by Dan Ketting, one of my favorite storytellers. And I tell this with his permission. The name of the story is One Tear. Long ago, there was a boy who lived in a village. His job was to take the flock of sheep up into the hills above the village to graze. He would take his dog along with him, who would watch the sheep while they were grazing, and the boy would play his little stringed instrument and sing songs. You see, the boy loved to listen to the old people sing the songs in the village square. And so when he went with the sheep up into the hills, he would take his stringed instrument and practice playing and singing those village songs. One day, he took his sheep far up into the hills, and he came to a small valley that had lush green grass. He had never been to this valley before, and with the help of the dog, he herded the sheep into the lush green grass where they began to contentedly graze. And while they were grazing, he decided to explore this new valley. And he noticed off to one side there were cliffs, so he headed over there. And as he got closer, he saw at the bottom of the cliff there was a huge cave. And he thought, this is going to be good to know. If a storm comes up, I could bring the sheep into the cave for shelter. And when he got to the cave, he found out it was enormous. And he started going into the cave, but soon it was in the dark and he couldn't see a thing. He couldn't see how far back it went. So he came out of the cave, and there at the front entrance to the cave, there was a large rock just the right size for sitting on. So he sat down, got out his string instrument and began to play and sing the village songs. After about 30 minutes, he decided he was hungry. So he put his instrument down, got out his lunch, and he was about to begin eating when a voice came out of the cave. "Play another one." Well, that startled the boy, and he turned around. He had his back to the cave. He turned around, looked, and he couldn't see anything. It was all dark in that cave, and he was a little bit afraid. So he packed his lunch back in and picked up his instrument and was about ready to leave when the voice spoke again. "Please, please play another song." Well, the boy relaxed, and he decided to go ahead and play and sing another song. And when he finished, the voice in the cave told a story, and it was a beautiful story. And when the story was finished, the boy played and sang another song. And when he finished, the voice in the cave told another story. And that's the way it went for the rest of the day, until it was time for him to say goodbye and take the sheep back to the village. And the voice said, "Will you come back again to visit me?" And the boy said, "Oh, yes, yes, this was fun." So he did. He came back. Every day he'd take the sheep to that valley and take turns singing and playing his songs and listening to stories. And the stories were wonderful. Stories of knights in shiny armor, stories of valor and battle, stories of love, stories of sadness, stories of happiness, stories of promises kept and promises broken. Well, one day when he was taking turns listening to the stories and playing and singing his songs, he stayed longer than usual. And the sun was getting low in the western sky, and the cave was facing west. And so the sun's rays began to creep into the cave to show the boy who was telling the stories. At first, the sun glimmered on the razor-sharp talons. Then it illuminated the two large tree trunk-like legs, and then the long body covered with green scales, and the large brown leathery wings folded to its side, the long serpent-like neck, and the head with the two horns on the top, and smoke coming out of the nostrils. The boy was looking at a dragon. And as the dragon was telling his story, the boy walked into that sunlit cave, and the dragon was telling a sad story about his own life. And he was talking about how he was the last of his kind living that he knew of, and he was very lonely living all alone in that cave, and was afraid he might die all alone in that cave. And as the dragon was telling the story, he had his eyes closed and tears were streaming down his face. And just as the dragon finished this sad story by himself, the boy set his hand on the dragon to comfort him. The dragon's eyes flew open, and he said, "Aren't you afraid of me?" The boy smiled and said, "I'm not afraid of you." The dragon said, "Don't you know I could tear you to pieces with these sharp talons?" The boy giggled. "Don't you know I could burn you to a crisp with my fiery breath?" The boy laughed. "Why aren't you afraid of me?" "I can't be afraid of you," said the boy. "I've heard your story." And then the dragon said, "Will you still come visit me now that you know I'm a dragon?" "Of course," said the boy. And he did continue to visit. One day he asked the dragon if he'd be willing to come live in the village with him. "Come live with me in the village, then you won't be all by yourself in this dark, cold cave." "Oh, no, 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 no," the dragon said. "Can't do that. Your people and mine have been fighting each other for thousands of years. If I showed up in your village, your men would get their spears and their bows and arrows and their swords, and they'd attack me. No, 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 it'd never work." "Well," said the boy, "I'm going to try to figure out a way to make it work." That evening, when the boy was listening to the old people sing their songs in the village square, one of the singers in between songs said, "Isn't it sad how nobody ever comes to visit our village anymore?" They all go to that village down by the river. And another singer said, yes, yes, it's so sad. And we have such beautiful songs and beautiful voices, but nobody ever comes here anymore. And the boy had an idea. He jumped up and he ran to the mayor's house. He knocked on the mayor's door. The mayor answered and said, what do you want? The boy said, is it true that nobody ever comes to visit our village? Yes, said the mayor, it's so sad. It's true. Nobody ever comes to visit our village anymore. Well, said the boy, I have an idea of how we can get people to come back here. Really, said the mayor, how? I know a storyteller, and he's the best storyteller in the world. He can bring people back to our village. That's great, said the mayor. Bring him to my house so I can listen to the stories. Oh, no, that won't work, said the boy. You see, my friend's kind of shy. Yes, he's shy. It would work better if you went to his home. Okay, said the mayor, I can do that. And I could also have our village council members go too, so they can hear this storyteller of yours. And the boy said, yes, that'll work, but there's one more thing. When we get close to the storyteller's home, I'll have to put blindfolds on you because you see, my friend, besides being shy, he's kind of self-conscious and insecure. Self-conscious, shy, insecure storyteller? That's strange, said the mayor. But if it will make people come back to our village, I guess I'm willing to give it a try. And so the next morning, when the boy took his sheep to that valley, along came the mayor and the village council members. And when they got to the valley, the boy helped the dog get the sheep into the grazing area. And then he put blindfolds on all of the council members and the mayor, had them hold hands and follow him, holding hands, to the cave. When they got to the cave, he had them sit in kind of a semicircle, leaving a large open space for the dragon to complete the circle. And then he called for his friend to come out and tell the stories. And the stories were wonderful. The dragon told stories of valor that stirred their blood. He told stories of love that melted their hearts. He told sad stories that made them cry, and happy and funny stories that made them laugh and smile. And then finally, he started telling the story about himself, the sad story about being lonely, living by himself, and being afraid of dying by himself in the cave. And as he was telling this story, he had his eyes closed, and tears started streaming down his cheeks. And one of the tears landed on the mayor's hand. Now, this got the mayor's attention because a dragon teardrop is pretty big. And so the mayor took off his blindfold and looked up to see if maybe a storm was coming, but instead he saw the dragon. And then he took off the blindfold of the council member next to him, and he put up his finger to gesture to be quiet, and gestured for that person to take the other person next to him, take the blindfold off, until they all had their blindfolds off. And very quietly, they closed the circle in towards the dragon. And as the dragon finished the sad story about himself, they all placed their hands on the dragon to comfort him. And the dragon's eyes flew open and he looked down, and the mayor looked up and said, would you be willing to come to live in our village and be our official storyteller? Oh, yes, said the dragon. Yes, I would like that very much. Good, said the mayor. Now I have one small favor to ask. Oh, yes, anything. What favor do you want? Can you give us a ride back to the village? And the dragon smiled a toothy smile and said, of course. And he lowered himself down as low as he could, and the mayor and the council members climbed up onto his back. The boy had to stay and take his sheep back to the village, but he waved to them as the dragon opened up his wings and lifted up into the air and flew down to the village square. As the dragon was flying there, of course, he attracted attention, and people came running towards the village square where the dragon landed. And the mayor and the council members got off of his back, and the mayor introduced the dragon as their new official storyteller, and the dragon started to tell some stories. And he was an immediate success. They loved his stories, stories of promises kept and promises broken. And the next day, word started to spread. into the countryside about the new dragon storyteller, and people started coming to that village from the surrounding area. And after several weeks, they were coming long distances to hear the dragon storyteller. So he was able to live out the rest of his life in that village as their storyteller. And when the time came for him to pass on and his life to end, he did not die alone in a cold, dark cave. He died surrounded by friends, with his head resting to his special friend, a man who as a boy used to sing songs to the dragon. And so all of the fear and all of the hate had been washed away with that one tear and replaced with understanding and love with the help of the power of story. That's One Tear by Dan Ketting. So now I switch roles and I go back to being the master of ceremonies, and I would like to introduce Elisabeth Anghel. She is a retired librarian whose career spans almost 3 decades of working in different capacities in academic libraries. She has been telling stories at the Inland Valley Storytellers monthly swap meetings for several years. The Tellabration 2020 is her first time to tell in an Inland Valley Stories Tellabration. So please welcome Elisabeth Anghel. And Angela, switch the spotlight to Elisabeth. And unmute yourself.
Yes, I did. Thank you, everyone, and good evening. I'm glad to see that my family joined, and also I have a few friends that also joined, and I want to acknowledge them. So the story tonight is a story from the folklore of the Balkans. It's from a collection translated and edited by D.I. Ashliman. And the story goes like that. Long time ago,
You can't hear me? Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Say closer.
Long time ago, in a faraway country, young people got together and they decided they don't need old people around because they were just as clever as the old people are. So they don't need their advice and counsel. And they decided that all people lived their life and that was the end of it. They should be eliminated. And they took this idea to the king. The king was also a young man. He agreed to that and gave an order, a strict order, that all old people should be killed. In that time, in that country, lived a young man, and he was not able, he didn't have the heart to kill his old father. So against the king's orders, he hid his father in the cellar under the house, and at night, very careful, he will go and take care of his father's needs and bring him food. The country was doing well. It was prosperity. The fields grew crops, plenty for everyone. The vineyards were flourishing. The orchards, the trees were full with fruits. Everybody had enough to eat and they were all happy. But it didn't last too long. It happened then one summer, the drought showed up, no rain. The heat was very strong and it lasted the entire summer. So by the end of summer, there were no crops in the fields. The fields were all parched by the sun and the lack of water, the lack of rain. The trees withered and there were no fruits. So people start being worried. The cattle were hungry. They didn't have enough to feed the cattles. Starvation starts showing up, looking in people's faces. And then this terrible summer was followed by a very harsh winter, very cold. People never experienced that kind of cold. And snow, huge mounds of snow. There was no food. People were looking at their cattle perish, and death was looking in their faces. One evening, one night, the son took a morsel of food to his father. Was no food left. The father looked at his son and asked, "What happened with you? You look so sad and worried." The son then told his father about the misfortune that befell over the country. People were starving, cattle died. They didn't know where to go to find advice and counsel to help them survive these terrible times. The father said, "Don't worry. Do not worry. Wait until the snow start melting, and then when the ground is clear, go and plow the road in front of our home and the roads close by. Just plow the ground. Don't let anybody step over that part that you tilled, and do not answer to any questions." The son did just like the father told him. After the snow melted, the ground was moist and soft, and it plowed up very easily, and just let the ground rest, freshly plowed. As the weather started warming up and the temperature was favorable, they saw through the plowed ground that sprouts are coming up. Seeds are sprouting in the dirt. And then sure enough, as the spring and summer progressed, they saw with amazement crops growing up in that dirt that was freshly plowed on the roads. And corn and grains and wheat were showing up and growing beautifully. By the midsummer, they had beautiful and rich crops. The neighbors were looking in disbelief. They could not believe what happened. They could not understand. So they went to the king and told the king what happened. The king said, "Well, bring me that young man. We need to talk with him." So they brought the young man in front of the king, and the king said, "You know, this is not your wisdom. It must be your father that you are hiding against my orders. Tell the truth, and I will spare your life." And the son said, "Well, the king, my father told me to plow up the road in front of our house and the roads close by, and don't let anybody step over it, and wait." And sure enough, we saw seeds sprouting up, and now we are looking at this beautiful crop. The king said, "Bring me your father. I want him to explain his wisdom." So the son went and brought his father, and father went in front of the king. And he said, "Well, the road that ran all over the town and in front of our house and all over the neighborhood, the carts with crops are crossing by every year, go up and down the roads, and from that carts, seeds drop on the ground. People step over them. Cattle hoofs step over them. So in time, the seeds that fell from the carts, they are covered by dust and dirt, and they are completely buried in the dirt. If they left over there, they more likely they will rot. But then if we plow the road in the spring and the weather is favorable, is more likely that some of those seeds will sprout and will bring to a crop that we can use. This is a chance that we gave the seeds by plowing the ground, gave a chance to the seeds to germinate and grow and sprouts and become crops. Upon this chance, I base my advice to my son, and here it is that it worked. So now we have these beautiful crops for everybody in town, and also we are going to have seeds to plant for the next crop. Listening to this, the crowd of young people and the king, they realized how foolish they were to eliminate all people from their society. And then right there, they decided that all people should live in peace and honor until the end of their days. To illustrate this story from the Romanian folklore, Romanian wisdom, it is a proverb that I'm gonna give it to you. And it goes like this: if you do not have an elder in your family, buy one. Thank you.
All right, Elizabeth, that was great. Great story.
Thank you very much.
And being an elder person myself, I especially appreciate it.
Yeah, me too. Me too. We are in good company here. Thank you.
Okay, so time for me to introduce the next storyteller. Nick Smith is a teller of historical tales for adult audiences and traditional tales for all ages. In addition to putting on shows and helping run festivals, he has performed at unusual venues ranging from Victorian houses to courthouses. For many years, Nick was the leader of the San Gabriel Valley Storytellers in Los Angeles County. Nick became an active member of Inland Valley Storytellers in 2004 and has been a teller at almost all IVS concerts since the Tellabration 2004. Let's welcome Nick Smith.
Bravo.
Now, there's something you must understand. Wales is a land of magic and music, and they love both. Morgan, unfortunately, was the worst singer in all of Wales. In fact, one of the locals, an excellent singer, more bully than bard, had said about Morgan that his singing voice could be unfavorably compared to a goat being dragged backwards across broken pottery. Now, perhaps his voice wasn't that bad, but he did not have a good singing voice. He loved to sing, though. Music was in his heart. And whenever he wasn't busy working, and sometimes when he was busy working, he would sing off key and not necessarily to the right tempo, but he would sing, and he loved to sing. Well, other people didn't care for his singing much, so they didn't stay around when he was singing. And he was often alone as a result. Even though he was married, his wife would find someplace else to be when he was in a musical mood. One day, Morgan was sitting at home. He had finished a good morning's work and was resting after a brief bit of lunch when there was a knock at the door. "What's a door for but to come in then?" And in the door walked 3 men in rough clothing, all raggedy, and one of them weakly came up and said, "Please, sir, do you have some food and a bit of drink you can spare for travelers? We're weary and hungry." And Morgan said, "Help yourself. There's bread and cheese on the table and some good cider there in the pitcher. Eat and drink what you will." And the men stood there and ate a bit and drank a bit. And their mood was very pleased because they had learned something, that Morgan was a generous man. Well, as they turned to leave, one of the men said, "Now, sir, you've been so kind and generous to us. Is there something you want out of life that you do not have?" And Morgan thought to himself and said, sure, but it's not something I've had the time or money for. I'm not a good singer, but the music of the harp, oh, I would love to be able to play that. It would take years and a great deal of training, though. And the man said, perhaps, perhaps. And they walked out the door and closed it. And as Morgan watched them leave, behind him there was a thump. And he turned, and there, beside him, was a full Welsh triple harp. Now, you may have seen harps, but you've usually seen the simple kind, you know, the kind where you can flick little levers and knobs and change flats and sharps and things. Oh no, the triple harp is the old style. 3 rows of strings, one for the natural notes, one for the sharps, and one for the flats. And it takes the most talented harpist years to learn how to play that properly. Well, Morgan fell in love with the look of it instantly, but he thought, I don't know if I'll ever have time to learn to play this. Oh, but such a pretty thing. And he ran his fingers down the strings, and it made music. And he put both hands on the harp and moved his fingers on the strings, and it began to play a nice little tune, one you could dance to. And Morgan thought, oh, those were no normal men. Those must have been of the fair folk, for that's what they called those of the old folk who lived in the land long before mankind. Well, Morgan was still fiddling with the harp and playing the strings and getting music to come out when his wife came back with a couple of the neighbors. She had heard harp music as she approached rather than Morgan's usual singing, so she had no fear of letting them in. And they came in and she said, Morgan, where did you get such a harp and when did you learn how to play it? And Morgan said, oh, I was nice to some folks and they gave me a harp and somehow I know how to play it. Well, as they stepped across the threshold into the house, his wife and her friends began to dance to the music. Morgan, what's this? We're dancing. What are you doing? Oh, and he stopped playing and they stopped dancing. And he said, why, there's magic in this harp. It causes the listeners to dance once they're in the house. Would you like me to play something for you and that you know you'll want to dance sometime? And his wife looked at the neighbors and they looked back and said, play something short now and we'll see. And so Morgan played a short dance tune and they loved the music and they loved dancing to it. Well, so it came to pass that the neighbors were invited over from time to time for dancing. And Morgan would play a tune or two and then everybody could refresh themselves and then he'd play some more and everyone would stop and talk and chat a bit. And everyone was so happy to see Morgan playing music that didn't make your ears hurt the way his voice had done. But as time went on, word of the music of Morgan went out through the neighborhood and through the village and finally got to the ears of the bully who had said such terrible things about Morgan's voice. And he had to hear what Morgan was doing now. So on one of the evenings, he'd been told that Morgan would be playing for the neighbors to dance. He came, uninvited, of course, and came to the door and said, "'Tis such a pleasure to hear you making good music," with the emphasis on the word good. Well, the next time there was a break in the music, he told the others, Go out and refresh yourselves outdoors. And you, come on in so you can see and hear my music more closely. Well, his wife and his neighbors went outside, and the bully came in. And Morgan said, now watch closely as I play. And he began to play, and the bully found himself dancing. What's this? What's this? I'm dancing to your music. Stop that. And Morgan laughed and laughed and kept playing. And the bully danced and danced, and Morgan played and played, and the bully finally begged Morgan, stop, please, stop. I'll never insult your singing again. Just let me stop dancing. And Morgan stopped and pulled his fingers off the strings. And the bully fell to the floor, for his feet and his knees and his hips and everything in between were worn to a frazzle. So he crawled out of the house, and it was several minutes before he could manage to get himself standing. And Morgan said, that'll teach you not to be so mean to folks. But Morgan had not quite learned that lesson himself because of the way he'd been so mean to the bully. Well, his wife and his neighbors came back in, but they were very hesitant about dancing long sets of music. And the party wasn't as much fun, with them being afraid that Morgan would do things to them too. So the party ended early. Everyone went home, but his wife came in and said, you wouldn't hurt people, would you, Morgan? And Morgan said, nah, just wanted him to learn a lesson. Well, he and his wife went to sleep, but in the morning when they woke up, there was no harp. For the fair folk don't like it if you abuse their gifts. And Morgan, well, he learned a lesson about being a bully himself. But don't you know, he'd had so much fun with the music of that harp that he went back to singing. Oh, not always so far off tune, but bad enough that the birds would fly away when he started to sing, and bad enough that the neighbors would wait till he was finished singing to come over and visit. But he sang from his heart rather than from his fingers. And you know, maybe that's good enough. And that's the old Welsh tale of the magic harp.
That's great, Nick. Thank you. That was a great story. And it's time for me to introduce the next storyteller, and that's Rae Kraut. She has been blending story, song, and creative movement in schools, libraries, museums, and theaters from California to East Tennessee since 1990. She earned a master's degree in storytelling from East Tennessee State University and has toured for the Smithsonian and was commissioned by the McCallum Theater to create a storyteller's version of Mozart's The Magic Flute. She has been performing regularly in Inland Valley Storytelling concerts since 2005. Please welcome Rae Kraut.
Hi, everyone. It's so exciting to be here with all of you. And I want to share a story that goes with the season. And I learned this story from maybe 5 or 6 wonderful books that I read at the Riverside Library. And it's based on an Israeli and Yemeni folktale. And it goes like this. I die, di bidi bye bye, di die, die, die. It's a story of a great king, and maybe you've heard of him. His name was King Solomon. Yai die, di bidi bye bye, di die, die, die. Oh, he was a great king. He came to the throne when he was only 12 years old. And they say that when he was only 12 years old, one night he had a dream. And in the dream, God spoke to him and said, "Oh, Solomon, you may have whatever you desire, only ask." And Solomon asked to be the wisest man in the world. And they say his wish was granted. Well, Solomon could answer any riddle. He could solve any problem. And his fame spread far and wide. He also had a magic ring. And when he wore his magic ring, he could understand the language of the birds. Now, he loved the birds, but his very favorite bird was the hoopoo bird. Now, I want to see. You can see this picture. The hoopoo bird is right there on Solomon's wrist. Oh, he loved that bird. And the bird loved King Solomon. And one day, the hoopoo bird decided to fly as far as he could go to see what was the end of King Solomon's kingdom. And he flew and flew for many days until he came to the land of Sheba. And there he learned that their queen, the Queen of Sheba, was known as the wisest woman in the world. And the hoopoo bird thought to himself, why, King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba should meet. So he flew to the palace of that great queen, and she also, being so wise, knew how to understand the language of the birds. And the hoopoo bird told her all about King Solomon and said, "Oh, great queen, you must come and visit my king in the great city of Jerusalem." Oh, the Queen of Sheba was intrigued. And so she decided to take the hoopoo bird's advice. So she gathered her hundreds of servants and her many great nobles, and they brought gifts, extraordinary gifts. And her great warriors, she brought her great warriors as well, and they traveled. It took them a long time, but finally they stood outside the gates of the great city of Jerusalem. And the servants began to play on their great drums. And you could show this if you want to. You could do it in your house. Boom, 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 boom. Boom, 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 boom. And when the servants drummed, those warriors stood up and they danced, showing their skill and their strength, shaking their spears. And then all those nobles came to the front, displaying their fine gifts, their silks, their gems, their gold, their exotic animals, until the great gates of the city of Jerusalem opened to them. And there to greet them was King Solomon himself. And when he saw the beautiful queen, he said, "Oh, great queen, oh, you have brought so much. What can I do to reply to all your gifts and all your bounty?" And the queen said, "There is only one thing I ask, great king. Show me something, teach me something I do not know." And so King Solomon brought the great queen into his throne room, sat her beside him on the throne. Of course, all her nobles and warriors and servants came along, and Solomon answered all of her questions. He solved every riddle she said to him. He read to her from his great book, the Song of Songs. And then he said, "Is there any more? Is there anything else you wish, great queen?" And she said, "I wonder, yes, you are very wise, you know many things, but what power does it give you? What can you do with all this knowledge?" And Solomon said, Ask me anything, and I will do it. The Queen of Sheba said, make me a tower made of bird beaks. Everyone was shocked when she said that. Oh no, why that would take the beaks of all the birds in the world. And King Solomon, what could he do? He had to keep his promise. So he took the Queen of Sheba to the top of the tallest tower of the city, and then he reached out and he called to all the birds from the north, the south, the east, and the west, come, come, bring me your beaks. And the sky grew dark with all the flapping of wings, and all the birds gathered around him. But one bird was not there, and I bet you know what bird it was. It was the hoopoe bird. His favorite bird did not come. So King Solomon sent the eagles after him, and finally they brought the hoopoe bird in front of the king. Aren't you ashamed not to come when I call you, hoopoe bird? And the hoopoe bird said, Your Majesty, I cannot give up my beak so readily. Here is what I propose. I will ask you 3 riddles. If you cannot answer all 3 of them, I ask that every bird gets to keep their beak. But if you can answer all of them, I will give you my beak. The birds were shocked that the hoopoe would try to make a bargain with the great king. But King Solomon said, yes, I will do it. He was confident because he could answer any riddle. Tell me, ask me your first riddle. The hoopoe bird said, well, what is it that is delicate enough to feed a baby and yet strong enough to break through wood? King Solomon thought, I know, it's a bird's beak. Am I right? And he looked at all the birds, and the birds said, oh yes, oh yes. And then they hung their heads and their beaks hung down. King Solomon thought, their beaks are so important. What will they do without them? Then the hoopoe bird said, all right, here's my second riddle. Who is it who was never born and will never die? King Solomon knew the answer to that. Why, the Lord of all creation, the one who made all the creatures, including the birds. Then King Solomon thought, the Lord made all those birds to go on forever, and yet I'm changing them. But then King Solomon turned to the birds and said, am I right? Am I right? And the birds said, oh yes, oh yes. Oh, the hoopoe bird had only one more riddle, but he plucked up his courage and he asked the king, oh great king, what is the water that doesn't come up from the ground and doesn't fall down from the sky? King Solomon thought. He said, it's a tear. A tear doesn't come up from the ground. It doesn't fall from the sky. It falls from a sad eye because of an aching heart. Am I right? And all the birds said, oh yes, oh yes. And they hung their heads and tears fell from their eyes. And King Solomon could say nothing. Then he turned to the beautiful queen. Oh, great queen, I am so sorry. I must break my promise to you. I have no right to take the beaks of the birds, the Lord's creation. Please forgive me. The Queen of Sheba said, "Oh, great king, I wanted you to teach me something I didn't know, and you have taught me that. Why, you have taught me that it's better to break a promise than to do something that is wrong." And then she smiled at King Solomon, and he smiled at her. And then she said, "But there's one more thing we must do. What can we do to reward the hoopoe bird who has taught a king and a queen a lesson and saved the birds of all the world?" So King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba put their heads together. And you know what they did? They gave the hoopoe bird a beautiful little gold crown, and they placed it right on its head. But the most amazing thing, wonder of wonders, as soon as that crown was placed on the hoopoe bird's head, it changed to feathers. And from that day to this, the little hoopoe bird has a beautiful crown of feathers. I die, dee biddy bye bye, dee bye bye bye. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Karen Rae. That was a wonderful, wonderful story. Thank you very much. Okay, the next storyteller is Ron Chick. And Ron is a retired teacher and was telling stories in the classroom setting for over 30 years. Now that he is retired, Ron has the freedom to go most anywhere for the opportunity to tell and teach the art of the spoken word. He actively participates in many storytelling groups throughout Southern California. He was the leader of the Riverside storytelling group called Tales Down by the Riverside for many years. Ron joined the Inland Valley Storytellers in 2010 and has performed in every IVS concert since the spring of 2010. Please welcome Ron Chick.
I told this story in a Tellabration 3-4 years ago, and I told it today to my granddaughter's classroom. But in looking it up again, I discovered that there are versions of this story that have been written in the Brown Fairy Tale book, and has its own little children's book called Grasscutter's Gifts. So my version goes like this. The tale of Wally Dodd, the generous. There was a grass cutter named Wally Dodd, sometimes by his neighbors called Wally Dodd Gunjay, for he was very bald. He made his living by going from his little hut at the side of the road out into the wadi and swamplands and cutting grass and carrying the grass in bundles back into the village to sell as fodder for the animals. And for this, he earned usually 5 pennies a day. But his needs were simple, for he lived alone, had no wife or children, and he would spend 2 or 3 pennies on food, and every once in a while buy an article of clothing. But if he had any coins left over, he would reach under his pillow at night and drop them down into a jar buried in the ground, as his father had done before him, and for all he knew, his great-grandfather before that. And he had done this all his life against the day when he could no longer cut the grass. But as the year went on, this particular year, the sound of the coins hitting other coins seemed to change. And one night, he dropped in 2 more pennies, and one of them slipped off into his hand. He looked down and realized the jar was full. Well, he thought, tomorrow, instead of cutting grass, I shall have to dig the jar out and see how many coins I have. Perhaps I can buy a new mattress or another set of clothing. I don't need much, but that would be more comfortable. And so the next morning, he moved his furniture aside and dug what he thought would be a small jar. But as he had dug and expanded his hole, the jar became an enormous urn. He cannot imagine where whichever one of his ancestors had put it in there he had ever found such a thing. When he poured out the coins, there were so many that he couldn't imagine how he could possibly protect them, keep them. And he thought, I must buy something, buy something of worth that will allow me to store things more reasonably than this. And so he went into the town and went to his friend, the jeweler, who often bought grass from him, and said, I can't even count the coins I have. Hey, have you anything I can buy with them that will make my fortune more worthwhile, more easily transported and protected? The merchant thought for a moment and said, years ago, I acquired a beautiful bracelet made with fine gems and beautiful gold. And no one in our town has ever been wealthy enough to purchase it. But I will happily trade it for your coins. And the agreement was made. And Wally looked at the beautiful gold and jewels on his wrist and thought, this is such a fine thing for an old man like me. Hey, I'm not sure I really want to keep it, but what can I do? No one could buy it from me. So after thinking for a couple of days about this, he went to another friend, this one, a traveling merchant who took caravans out through the east and came back. And he said to him, you've been to many places and lands. Is there in your travels a princess, who is as kind as she is beautiful? Ah, yes, that there is, my friend. I have been to the courtyards of every kingdom, and have seen many fine people, but none can compare to the princess of Taristan. She is beautiful, she is kind, she is wise, and all of her people love her. Well, if that be the case, I think perhaps you could take this bracelet to her as a gift from an old man who wants to reward her kindness to the world. The merchant smiled and agreed to do this. And some days later, he departed. And when he reached Taristan, he did his other business and then went and presented himself to the palace, holding a scented box that he had placed the bracelet in. When he saw the princess, he handed it to her and said, I'm an admirer from afar, wanting to reward your grace and beauty. And she looked at the beautiful, expensive bracelet and thought, I don't know quite what to say here. So she looked at the merchant and said, come back in the morning and I'll have a message for your friend. So the merchant agreed and came back the next morning. And when he got to the palace, in the courtyard was the princess standing next to a beautiful camel. And on the camel's back, such a load as the camel could barely hold it, were stacked bolts and bolts of precious silks in all the colors that could be imagined. Hey, take this to this Wally and thank him for his generosity. Well, the merchant took his caravan back to his hometown, and then the next morning took his horse and the camel and started out to Wally Dodd's little house. And Wally Dodd saw them coming and thought, a camel will need grass. I can get some grass right now and sell it to the person who owns the camel. And maybe I won't even have to go into the village today. And so he quickly gathered some grass from the day before and rushed out and cut some grass that was close by and was coming back to his house when he realized that he knew the horse, he knew the rider, but he didn't know the camel. And when he got there, the merchant showed him all of these beautiful silks. And he said, silk? My new cotton smock is all I need. What would I do with these fine things? Surely you must know someone in the wide world who would truly need them. or would make good use of them. The merchant thought for a moment and said, well, there is the king, the prince of Nakadad. He is brave and courageous, but he is also wise and can be kind. And he loves fine silks that he can put on his horses. Perhaps I can take some of them to him. Well, that would be out of your way, so be sure to reward yourself with some of the silk. And when you've delivered them, sell the camel, and that will take care of any cost you incur on your journey. And so the merchant made plans to go to Nicobad and did. And he presented the camel to the prince. And the prince looked at him and said, this is a very fine gift to be given by a stranger. I'll have to think about what to do about it. Come back in the morning. And when he did, there in the courtyard with the prince waiting for him were 20 beautiful horses of the breed for which his land was famous. And on each of them were beautiful saddles and chests of silver. He said, this Wally must be quite a person, but I can't let his generosity go unanswered. Take these to him. Well, the merchant couldn't refuse, but was feeling very uncomfortable, for this simple act was getting very complicated. And so he turned around and he hired some men to ride with him, because you couldn't carry all those chests of silver through open countryside. And so he finally arrived back in his home village and went out the next morning with the horses to deliver them to Wally. Wally saw them coming and thought, that's a whole troop of horses. Surely they'll be able to buy all my grass today. And he went to cut grass. But as he was cutting grass, he looked back over his shoulder and realized they were not going to pass by. They were coming straight to his house. And he turned around and came back, and there was his friend, the merchant, saying, the prince was so generous. He has sent these 20 horses with their silver to you as a reward for your kindness. 20 horses with silver? I have never ridden on even one horse, and I have no need of one. My life is as I like it now. I don't know what. Could you by chance take them back to the princess of Afghanistan? I do not know, said the merchant. This is getting very uncomfortable, and I don't know how this can end well. Well, take a few of the horses for yourself and take the rest to Karistan. For surely she can make more use of this beautiful silver and these fine horses than I can. Reluctantly, the merchant made arrangements to take the caravan to Karistan. And when he arrived there, the princess was looking out next to her father, the king, when the gates were opened and in trooped beautiful horses, all lovely saddles and obvious wealth on their backs. And so the princess went down, and the merchant said, my friend Wally Dodd has sent these in reply to your silks, hoping that you will find them pleasant and find a way to use them to make the world and your people happier. I don't know quite what to say to this. We will, of course, accept them, but I need to talk to my father. Come back in the morning. When she went up to talk to her father, she told him how the beautiful bracelet had been rewarded with this beautiful silks. And now that had been rewarded with all these horses with silver. And the king said, this Wally Dodd must be a man of great wealth and power, perhaps a king even greater than myself, and he must have immense wealth to send such beautiful gifts. Perhaps he is seeking you for his bride. And if the man is what I think he might be, you might perhaps consider him. And so the plan was made. They ordered that a great caravan with camels and horses and elephants, all bedecked in beautiful silks and clothing, all saddled, all carrying great gifts, be made ready. And they called out their army, and they set off with a great caravan off to the house of Wally Dodd. The merchant was terrified. He thought, what horrible manner of death will the king put us to when he finds out that Wally Dodd is not a king, not a prince, not even a noble person of any kind. He's just a kind old man. He'll kill us for sure. I can't get away. I'm surrounded by servants all the time. And I wish I could figure out something to do. There's just nothing I can do. I know. This must rest in the hands of the fates. There is nothing I can do. And so he rode with ever darker thoughts toward the home of Wally Dodd. And the day before they would have reached them, he said to the king, we can't arrive there unannounced. Let me go ahead by a day, and I will tell him that you are coming. And I'm sure he'll make preparations for you. Well, that is fine, said the king and his daughter. We shall wait a day and see how this magnificent Wally Dodd greets foreign leaders. And so the merchant made his way quickly to Wally's house and told Wally what was going on, thinking, I don't know what to do. I don't know this is all. But Wally had no thought for himself. He only thought for his friend. I have placed you in great danger. My kindness has been turned against us. Go back to the king and leave me to think about what I must do. I don't know what I must do. I will think of something, but there must be some way out of this that will at least spare your life. The merchant was reluctant to leave his friend with this burden, but Wally was insistent, and so he left. It was now quite dark, and Wally walked in front of his house for a few minutes and thought, there is but one way out. He climbed up the hillside and over to the cliffs that overhung the great river, and the jagged rocks below. If I am not alive when the king arrives, at least he may spare my friend. He took a step back and meant to hurl himself off the edge. He took a few steps forward and then just could not do it. With that, he collapsed on the ground and began to sob. As he was lying there, the light shone around him, and he thought, it cannot be close to dawn yet. And he looked up, and there behind him were two beings surrounded by glowing light. And he knew instantly that they were angels sent from paradise. And he trembled and said, what do you hear? The first of the pair placed his hand upon his arm and lifted him to his feet and said, we know your troubles, Wally Dodd. Come, stand, speak with us. And as he stood, he looked down and realized that his cotton smock was now beautiful silken robes, and about his feet were sandals, not ordinary sandals, but beautiful slippers. And on his head, he felt a turban with jewels. Wally Dodd, your kindness and generosity has been noted and will be rewarded. Come with me, said the second fairy, and led him back toward what his house would be. But somehow everything had changed. In the brief moments he had been away, his house had vanished, and in its place was a beautiful palace. Where once there had been swamplands, there were beautiful gardens with magnificent trees growing. And he was surrounded by servants. But the angel kept leading him forward and took him into his new bedchamber, and said, rest well, tomorrow will go very well for you indeed. He lay down and thought, this must all be a dream, and fell asleep. But when he awoke the next morning, it was not a dream. He had servants waiting to serve him and dress him. And no sooner had he finished a better breakfast than his usual, when the trumpets sounded and the drums rolled, and up came the king and princess from Kurdistan. Wally welcomed them into her home, and his servants had prepared a magnificent feast for that first night. And there was music and dancing and food. Hey. The next night, the Kurdistans returned the favorite. They prepared a magnificent feast. Hey. And so they feasted late into the night. But on the third night, the king went to Wally Dodd and said, I suspect this was all because you thought you could talk my daughter into marrying you. You are a wonderful host. But I'm not. And Wally held up his hands and said, oh, your majesty, that is an honor far beyond my humble station. And I am an old man with one foot in the grave. I cannot marry such a young and beautiful woman. Well, what are we to do? I know of a prince, a marvelous prince, a man of honor and wealth and wisdom. Perhaps he would be willing to come and visit, and maybe things will work out. And so with some of the soldiers and some of the courtiers, the merchant set off and traveled quickly to Neckarbrand, taking some beautiful but simple gifts with him. And the prince, remembering the first gifts and remembering how he had sent back others, said, yes, I will come with you. And as happens in stories, the prince and the princess, of course, fell head over heels in love and were married. And the kings and prince and princess went back to their own kingdoms. And Wally Dodd, the kind and simple peasant, lived the rest of his life in comfort and peace.
Thank you, Ron. That was a wonderful story. Thank you very much. Okay, so the next teller is Stephanie Towns. And Stephanie was an elementary school teacher for 35 years. The last 6 years, she was a storyteller in residence at her school. She enjoys telling folktales, fables, and personal stories. Her mother was a storyteller, and she passed down the love of stories to most of her children. This is her third time telling at an Inland Valley Storytellers concert. Please welcome Stephanie Towns.
Am I there? Hi, my name is Stephanie Towns, and I have been very excited about being here again. This time that we have spent being at home, I have been spending time thinking about my childhood. So today I'm going to tell you a personal story that means a lot to me, and it's something that I hope for in the future. This story is called Just Stop By. When I was a child, where I lived in Massachusetts, I lived in a neighborhood, in a community that was so small that almost everyone was either a good friend or a relative. And one of the things that was so nice about that time was that if one of my brothers and I were out, maybe coming home from someone's baseball practice or going to do an errand, it started to snow, if we just wanted to take a break, we would look to see who we were close to. We might be near a cousin. We might be near a best friend, a classmate. We would walk down the street, walk up to someone's door, knock on the door, and when the door opened, we were always welcomed with a smile and an invitation to come in and visit and be with them. We would go in, we might stay an hour, we might stay 2 hours. We got to be involved in whatever it was that they were doing at that time. Of course, first the parents would have to ask us, how were our parents? How's my grandmother? How's all the family? And after all that was taken care of, we got to do whatever it was that they were doing. Once we stopped at a cousin's house, and when we were there, they were playing games. Well, we were happy to stay and play. We played Monopoly. We played Scrabble. We played cards, Go Fish. And we always got to have some kind of a snack. We would have a snack, and then when it was time, we would get back out on the street and start walking the rest of the way home. There were some times when we would be in my grandmother's neighborhood, which wasn't very far. We could walk. And the exciting thing about going to my grandmother's house was we were always welcome. Also, if we went to my grandmother's house and she wasn't at home, we all knew where she kept the spare key. So we could get the key, come in, and still visit, even if she wasn't there. Could be snowing. You might need to just go to the bathroom. But whatever it might be, we were always welcome. Now, if she was home, she'd open that door, welcome us with a smile, have us come in. She always had something yummy to eat, something on the stove, something in the refrigerator, but we were always made to feel welcome. One day, two of my brothers and I were out, and we decided to visit another relative on the way home. When we got there, we got to do what they were doing. After we knocked on the door opened. We were greeted with a smile and welcomed in. Once we got inside, we realized it wasn't exactly the greatest time because we ended up joining them doing spring cleaning. They were cleaning the closets. They were emptying their drawers in their rooms, getting out all the old clothes that didn't fit anymore. And since we were there and we were family, we got to join in and do that too. Now I work the past years with children who go to visit and play with friends, but their parents have to make a play date. When people go to visit, they make an appointment. Whenever people want to get together, it has to be over lunch or out to dinner. It's very rare now that people just stop by. So as I have been thinking about the theme of my life, how things change, this has been one of the things that I miss from my childhood, that I hope that someday will come back around again, when people don't make an appointment, don't have a plan, they just stop by. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Great story. Thank you very much. Okay, our next storyteller is Angela Lloyd. Angela has been one of the unique performers on the national storytelling circuit for many years, having been a featured teller at the 1997, 2003, and 2010 National Storytelling Festivals in Jonesboro, Tennessee, and regularly appears at regional festivals and theaters across the country. Angela has been a regular teller at Inland Valley Storytellers concerts since 2006. But I like the way Donald Davis describes her. Donald Davis says, Angela Lloyd is a combination of Maria von Trapp, Mary Poppins, and Tinkerbell. Please welcome Angela Lloyd.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. Good evening. Thank you, John. The story that I wanted to share with you tonight is a story that was told by John Lewis, our lovely, beautiful senator who passed away this year. May his memory be a blessing. And I first heard this story on Sunday morning on Weekend Edition in 1998 when his book Walking with the Wind came out. And Sunday morning, they would often do interviews with authors and writers when their books were coming out. And that's when I first heard him tell this story. And I'm going to just show you the cover of the book. It's called Walking with the Wind. And I just was so touched by this story. And as I said, it was 1998. And I was on my way that fall to Selma, Alabama, to tell stories at Catherine Wyndham's festival, which was in Selma, Alabama. And it happens I was born in Selma, Alabama, because my mother wanted to be with her mom when she gave birth, and her mother lived in Selma. So that happens to be where I was born. We were there for 3 weeks. And my first passport picture is I'm a little baby. On that trip, Catherine Wyndham introduced me to the doctor that delivered me. So anyway, I was on my way to Alabama in the fall, and John Lewis's story takes place there. So here's the story. It's the prologue of the book. And he said he wanted to start the story of his life with a simple story, a small story, a true story that featured young children, a wood frame house, and a windstorm. John Lewis said that the children in this story were his cousins, Roy Lee and Jimmy Ray, Naomi, Leslie, Muriel, his older sister Aura, and his brothers Alfred and Edward. He said he was 4 years old, and that year his father had bought the first home that anyone in their family had ever owned. His father had earned his money, as many did in those times, tenant farming as sharecroppers. And his father had gathered together all the cash he had, which was $300. And he had bought a 3-bedroom house out off this red clay road right there in the county in Alabama that had pine forests and cotton fields. The house was sitting on 10 acres. It was peanuts and corn and cotton. And he said, while there was a war going on in Europe and in the Pacific, the world that he stepped out into was the world of stepping out of that house in the early morning. And all of the people that he saw were all relatives. Sounds like some of the other stories that we've heard tonight, this idea of being in a community, when you were children. And he said that the children would often be playing. And he said that in those times, they could just move from one house to another, as in to play. So one Saturday afternoon, there was about 15 children outside, and they were down at his aunt Suniva's house, and he had his Uncle Rabbit, good name. And all the children were out and playing when suddenly the sky started to get dark and a wind started to come up. And John Lewis wrote, he tells that he was really afraid of thunderstorms. If he had been at home, he would have run right inside to his mama, and his mother would have held him close. She used to say to him that thunderstorms, it was God, and God was doing his work. But he said on this day, they were at his aunt's house, and she came to the door and she called everybody in, and they all came in, and he said it just went from this moment of playing and noise and laughter to everybody suddenly inside the house. And he said too that he was really afraid of lightning as a young child because he had seen it hit, like one lightning strike a haystack and just burst into flames, or he'd seen lightning hit a tree and it would make the sap boil in the tree and it would split the bark and the bark would go flying through the air. So on this afternoon, his Aunt Saniva called all the children inside, and they were huddled together and they could just hear that wind just howling and howling outside. And they could hear the rain on the tin roof. And as they all got really, really quiet and just listening to that sound, when it started to feel like the house was just going to be lifted off the ground. And sure enough, across the room, they saw the wooden boards in the living room start to bend. And Aunt Saniva told the children to take hands, and all 15 of these children, in this hushed way, just walked together toward that corner of the house where the wooden boards were coming up. And they literally walked those boards down. And then as they turned around, the wind started pulling another corner of the house up. And they all, at her Aunt Saniva's direction, walked back across the house. He said from the kitchen to the living room. And he said they just walked back and forth and back and forth and just keeping that house on the ground. John Lewis said that image had become a metaphor for his life, and how in the 1960s with the civil rights movement, how every time society would show a weak corner of itself, he said the people of the house never left, that they stayed, and that society has just walked toward the weakest corner of the house and worked together. And he said, it's not about race, it's not about gender, it's not about class, it's not about anything that keeps us separate, but about us walking together. And he mentioned a concept that he writes about in the book called the beloved community. And he said that's just how he saw his whole life after that, was this sense of walking with the wind. He said the people never left the house. We've just walked together when the weakest corner of society had shown itself. We have just walked together and let that come on back down. So I wanted to, John asked if I would share that story tonight. It's something that I shared at another time. And because John Lewis, he has passed away, and may his memory be a blessing. But I was very touched by that story. And later that fall, when I went to Alabama, I was put in touch with distant cousins of my mother's and my mother's mother, my grandmother and her brother. And I made a ride way out into this rural part of Alabama where there was a lot of space between the houses. And I felt like I could see for myself this image that he described of those cotton fields and those red clay roads and that open space and those pine forests. So that's the story, walking with the wind.
Thank you, Angela.
You're welcome.
That's one of my favorite stories too, and such a good message for all of us today,
Mm-hmm.
where we really need to start pulling together instead of separating ourselves from each other. I think it's a very important message, and what better way to get it across than through a story. stories are powerful.
Mhm.
So I want to thank everybody and congratulate all the storytellers for wonderful stories this evening. And thank everybody who came to listen to those stories. And if you would like to at this point, oh, before I say that, I want to say I pasted in the links for donating to the National Storytelling Network or Inland Valley Storytellers. So it's at the bottom now of the chat window. And if at this point you'd like to unmute yourself and say something, ask a question or make a comment, you're welcome to do that now.
Yeah,
Wonderful stories, guys.
yeah. Thank you for coming, everyone.
Thank you for the wonderful stories. So enjoyed them all.